Hi, I'm Mr. Otway, Head of History at Ossett Academy, and this is an Ossett History Revision podcast. This time we're going to look at the conflict between white settlers from the United States and the Plains Indians, including the causes of the conflicts, some specific Indian wars, and finally we'll look at the destruction of the Indian way of life. We're going to start by looking at some general causes of the conflict. And the first major conflict of interest between the Indians and settlers came with the gold rush of 1848, when greedy prospectors trampled across the plains, setting up towns, killing buffalo, and sometimes killing Indians. Then the homesteaders set up on the Great Plains in the aftermath of the US government declaring the Great Plains public domain land. The division of land into farms disrupted the movement of buffalo and inevitably led to conflict with the Indians. From 1862 onwards, after the Pacific Railways Act granted land either side of a constructed track to railroad companies, there was increased conflict with the Indians. This could have been the principal reason, in general, for the conflicts. Railroads brought more settlers quickly to the plains. They helped the homesteaders to fence their land using barbed wire, further disrupting the buffalo movement. People went on buffalo hunts for sport, and the tracks crossed Indian territory, again further disrupting the nomadic life of the Indian. The boom in the cattle industry, and in particular after John Iliffe showed how profitable ranches could be, brought yet more opportunity for white settlers to disrupt the Indian way of life, and thus bring them into conflict. There's a very good cycle drawn in the textbook that effectively shows the more immediate cause of the conflicts between Indians and settlers. It goes like this. Settlers encroach onto Indian territory. Indians become hostile and attack the settlers. The US Army is called in. It defeats the Indians. A treaty is signed. Then settlers break the treaty, so the Indians attack settlers, so the army is called in, and so on and so forth. Well, now we're going to look at some specific Indian wars. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was the first of two Fort Laramie treaties, and is a good place to start as we look at four specific Indian wars. In that treaty, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes agreed to stop attacking travellers along the Oregon Trail, in return for a large stretch of land along the Rocky Mountains, which they believed they were getting forever. The US government also agreed to protect the Indians and pay them $50,000 a year. This was the first major example of the US government policy of concentration, which is to say, put the Indians all in one specific place, i.e. a large reservation, to make it easier to manage them. Unfortunately for US-Indian relations, gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains, so people who didn't care about the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, or more likely didn't know about it, trampled all over the Cheyenne and Arapaho lands. The two tribes went on the warpath, raiding and killing in white settlements. The US government summoned the tribal chiefs in 1861 and got them to agree to a smaller reservation. However, Indian chiefs are not like the bosses of the tribes. They had no power to force young braves to do this or that. They were more like respected guides, so many of the Cheyenne and Arapaho braves stayed on the warpath, thus showing that the policy of concentration and treaty signing didn't really work from the start. The US government were to stick to such a policy for a while yet, though. Next up, we have Little Crow's War of 1862. Here, Chief Little Crow and his tribe of Santee Sioux had been forced onto a reservation with promises of protection and compensation each year, just like with the Fort Laramie Treaty for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. However, in 1861 the crops failed, and the US didn't pay the money, which they'd promised, and if they had, it could have meant the Santee Sioux could buy food to help them survive. In 1862, with his tribe of over 12,000 starving, Little Crow had had enough, and took the tribe on the warpath in August 1862. They seized food warehouses and attacked US soldiers before the US Army defeated the Santee Sioux. By October, the Santee Sioux were forced to live on a smaller reservation, totally unsuitable for farming, with many of the water sources also unfit for drinking. In the first winter alone, many hundreds of Santee Sioux starved to death. So the Little Crow War of 1862 is an example of how the Indians got fed up with how they were being treated, fought back, and ended up with a worse deal than they had originally. The next significant event was not a war but a massacre, the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. This takes us back to the Cheyenne tribe, who were starving on their new smaller reservation, and had taken to robbing travellers for their food, but never harming them. The government sent officials to try to make a deal with the Cheyenne chief Black Kettle, and Black Kettle set up camp at Sand Creek, ready to strike a deal with the US. In the meantime, a general named Shivington decided to take matters into his own hands, and with a body of troops he attacked the Cheyenne, who thought they were under US protection, thought they were perfectly safe. He ended up killing 148, with more than half of the casualties women and children. Shivington lost just 9 men. Both white men and Indians were horrified, and it convinced other Indian tribes to step up their attacks when they heard of the massacre. Eventually, the US government signed an agreement with the Cheyenne to give them money and land in Oklahoma, but the Cheyenne had to give up the land around the Rocky Mountains. So in this example, the Indians didn't even fight back. They came to make a deal, ended up getting massacred, and still ended up with a worse deal than what they started with. Though the Indians were to have some success, because the Red Cloud War of 1865-68 was a rare example of a successful war by the Indians. White settlers had broken the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 because of the discovery of gold and had disturbed the hunting grounds of the Sioux. Red Cloud went on the warpath as US troops tried to build forts on Sioux land. He successfully disrupted the building of the forts and was joined by 2 other chiefs, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. In 1866, Red Cloud had his greatest victory when he ambushed 80 soldiers led by Captain Fetterman, wiping them out. This became known as Fetterman's Trap, and he went on to surround the US Fort Kearny, preventing US troops moving and travellers from travelling along the Bozeman Trail, which was the trail that was causing all the problems as it went right across Sioux lands to where the goldfields were. Red Cloud was successful because he managed to get several Sioux bands to work together, as well as some Indians from the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes. He also managed to get them to fight on through the winter months, which was not something that the Indians were accustomed to. The Red Cloud War showed the US that their previous attempts at peace with the Indians had not worked. Both Indians, and in particular white settlers, had broken the treaties. They decided to make a new treaty, and so the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed in 1868, 17 years after the first. In this, the US agreed to stop travellers from using the Bozeman Trail. They'd found a new route to get to the goldfields now anyway, so they weren't that bothered about that. And Red Cloud agreed to a new reservation which included the Black Hills of Dakota, a sacred place for Indians. Red Cloud was pleased. He thought he'd won. Finally, the last and most famous significant war on the plains was the Great Sioux War of 1876-77. And would you believe it, it was caused by white settlers who either didn't know about or didn't care about the Second Fort Laramie Treaty and started tramping over Sioux lands. The reason for this, would you believe it again, was because they had discovered gold, but this time it was really serious, because the gold had been discovered in the sacred Black Hills of Dakota, which, apart from their spiritual value to the Indians, had specifically been given to them in the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. The US government must have seen that trouble was about to arrive on the horizon, and offered the Sioux $6 million for the Black Hills, or $400,000 a year. But the Indians had no interest in selling their sacred land. A showdown was therefore inevitable, and it began with the US President Grant demanding all Sioux to return to their reservations. Some refused, and some couldn't get to them in time because of the onset of winter, and so the US dispatched an army under General Alfred Terry. Meanwhile, Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were not prepared to wait to be attacked, and after Sitting Bull received a vision, they went to attack and successfully wipe an army camp out at the Rosebud River on the 17th of June 1876. General Terry decided to send Colonel Gibbon to attack this Indian camp of Sioux warriors from the north. At the same time, he sent General Custer from the east. Custer commanded a cavalry regiment, so they travelled much faster than ordinary troops, and therefore much faster than Colonel Gibbon and his troops. Custer had orders to locate the camp and wait for Gibbons so they could attack together in force. General Custer, however, had other ideas. He wanted to take the biggest Indian camp he had ever seen down with the 600 men that he had of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, and he wanted to take all the glory. An all-out attack from hordes of Indians overcame Custer, in particular a charge from Crazy Horse and 1,000 Oglala Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Custer had split his force into 3 when he decided to attack, and commanded 225 troops personally. All 225 of Custer's troops, including Custer himself, had been slaughtered by the end of the battle. In the exam, you might be asked to give reasons for the Indian victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Here are some possibilities. Reason 1. Custer was too overconfident. He had fought Indians before and had never lost. His Crow tribe Indian scouts advised him to wait for reinforcements, but he ignored them. Reason 2. The Indian tribes were working together again and massively outnumbered the US troops. Reason 3. Custer split his forces into 3. This gave the Indians a chance to attack each of the 3 groups separately. The other 2 forces managed to escape, but Custer himself was cut down with all of his men. Reason 4. Before the battle, Custer had force-marched his men through mountains in an attempt to catch the Indians, so they arrived at the battle tired. And reason 5. Custer had poor information. He did not know how big the Sioux army was that he was attacking, nor that they were armed with Winchester repeating rifles, the latest, most modern rifles at the time. The Battle of Little Bighorn was a huge military victory for the Indians, but it could also be called a Pyrrhic victory, in that although it was technically a victory, in actual fact it led to the ultimate downfall of the Indians. The slaughter of 225 American men horrified ordinary Americans, who demanded that the US government do something about those damn Indians. This led to the systematic destruction of the Indian way of life, which we are about to look at in the next section of the podcast. The problem for the Indians was that no matter how big or how strong their armies might be, the US would always be able to summon a bigger and stronger army, given time and reason. The Indians could not have hoped to win a conflict with one of the wealthiest, most powerful and technological advanced nations in the world. Finally, we must look at why the US Army were able to defeat the Indians and what ultimately caused the destruction of the Indian way of life. One reason was because the US used Indians to help them defeat other Indians. There were some centuries-old Indian tribe rivalries, and the US played on this. They realised, for example, that the Shoshone and Crow tribes hated the Sioux, and would be willing to work for the army as scouts, which they did, and it made the job of defeating the Sioux a little easier for the US Army. A second reason was the building of forts. The Indians lacked the technology to overcome forts, and indeed they never successfully attacked and took over a fort, though they often surrounded them. The forts were places of safety and areas that the US Army could resupply or rest, right in the middle of Indian territory. A third reason was that the US Army was better supplied than the Indians. The Indians did have some modern weaponry, such as the latest Winchester repeating rifles at the Battle of Little Bighorn, but after the battle, when Crazy Horse and 250 warriors were eventually captured, they were found to have just 81 rifles and 33 revolvers between the 250 warriors. This can be compared to the US Army, in which every soldier received a rifle, without exception, and the US Army also had artillery and Gatling guns, which were an early type of machine gun. A fourth reason was that as the conflict with the Indians continued, the US turned to total war, in particular in their fight with the Sioux. Total war means basically anything goes, so the US continued to try to kill any Sioux warriors, but they also killed women, children, and the elderly. They destroyed Indian teepees and belongings, and animals such as horses, to try to limit the Sioux power. This was very successful, and not something that the Indians could do to the Americans. Finally, with regards to the army, the Indian tradition of warfare was to fight in the summer, partly because the Indians were so vulnerable in the winter. The US Army therefore ensured that they continued fighting during the winter, when they would be well fed and supplied from their forts, whereas the Indians were often freezing and starving. We have already mentioned the railroads, but the textbook states, and I quote, "What the railroads brought onto the plains completed the destruction of their way of life." So it is important to consider how this happened in more detail. Let's have another list. Firstly, the railroads crossed the buffalo hunting grounds, disrupting buffalo hunts, which as we know were vital to the Indian way of life. Not only this, but the railroads also brought tourists onto the Great Plains for their own buffalo hunts, where hundreds of buffalo would be shot for sport. Secondly, the railroads brought homesteaders, who also disrupted the Indian hunting grounds and sited farms on Indian land. The railroads also brought ranchers, who did the same, and before the ranches, the great cow drives to the railheads would obviously not have been possible without the railroads themselves, all of which disrupted the Indians. Thirdly, and finally, the railroads brought US troops quickly into Indian territory, along with supplies, making it easier for them to defeat the Indians militarily. The US Army and the railroads had important roles in the destruction of the Indian way of life, but so too did the US government, not only just because they controlled the US Army. I'd love a lovely list right now, this time of how the US government helped to destroy the Indian way of life. Firstly, the US government opened up the Great Plains, encouraging settlers through declaring the land public domain land, and subsequently passing the Homestead Act and then the Timber and Culture Act. This was all underpinned by the belief in manifest destiny, that it was the destiny for Americans to populate the West, regardless if any of Indians already lived there. At the same time, the US government began the policy of putting Indians in reservations, which for the free-roaming, hunting Indians was a dramatic change and did a lot to stop them living in their traditional way. The second key development came in 1887 with the Dawes Act, in which the US government decided that if the Indians were to behave like white men, which is an arrogant viewpoint really, then they had to be given land to farm. Each adult was to receive 160 acres of land, and each child in the family would mean the family received a further 80 acres. They were trying to turn the Indians into homesteaders, but this did not meet with great success. Many of the Indians did not want to, or could not farm, so they sold their land to white men, often for pitifully small amounts. There was also the fact that the Indians were, more often than not, given poor land to farm, and that coupled with the fact that they often had no experience of farming, meant that crops would fail. Ultimately, the Dawes Act ended with more Indians reliant on government handouts than before the Dawes Act. With the US government forcing Indians to farm, there was now the issue of what to do with the former Indian Territory, which brings us to the third major contribution of the US government to the destruction of the Indian way of life, the Oklahoma Land Race of 1889. It wasn't a race like the type you see in the Olympics. What happened was the government announced that 2 million square miles of former Indian Territory was to be opened up to settlers from the 22nd of April in 1889. So on April the 22nd, with thousands of people lined up on the borders of the Indian Territory, or former Indian Territory, bugles, guns and flags told the settlers that they could begin their race across Oklahoma to find land to settle on. 4 years later, in 1893, a further 6 million square miles were opened up. Just 60 years before all of this, the Cherokee Indians had been promised this land forever. Fourthly, the US government began to interfere in tribal structure. For example, they took away the power of the tribal chiefs by electing special courts from amongst the tribes and giving them an Indian agency police force to do their bidding. They also banned Indian feasts, ceremonies and dances, which took away the need for a medicine man. And they sent Christian missionaries in the place of the medicine men to try to turn Indians to Christianity. Finally, and perhaps most importantly in the US interference in Indian life, was the fact that the US government forced Indian families to send their children to boarding school. If a family refused, then they would not get their food rations, so they had little choice. There were 117 Indian boarding schools, in which one boarding school member stated that the aim was to kill the Indian in him and save the man. The result was that when the children returned, they did not really fit in with the tribes, but nor did they really fit in totally with the white way of life. Finally, and some would argue most important in the destruction of the Indian way of life, was the destruction of the buffalo, because as we know, the Indians relied on the buffalo for their way of life. In 1840, there was an estimated 13 million buffalo on the Great Plains, but by 1890 there were just 200 left. This can in part be blamed on the US government. For example, Frank H. Meyer, who was a buffalo hunter, remembered what he'd been told when entering a US Army camp, having been given as much ammunition as he wanted. "I asked an officer, what am I expected to do with this ammunition? Kill Indians?" "Hell no, that's our job," replied the officer. "You must kill buffalo. We'll take care of the Indians. Either the buffalo or the Indians must go. There isn't any other way. Only when the Indian becomes absolutely dependent on us for his every need will we be able to handle him. Every buffalo you kill will save a white man's life. Get to it!" The railroads, as we have already mentioned, played a part in the destruction of the buffalo, as they brought buffalo hunts to the plains as sport, where tourists would come and shoot hundreds of buffaloes. Buffalo Bill was the most famous buffalo hunter. It wasn't actually his name, just a nickname, but he was paid $500 a month to clear buffalo from the railroad tracks, and to supply the railroad workers with fresh meat daily. $500 a month was a fantastic wage in the 19th century. Buffalo Bill claimed to have killed over 4,000 buffalo in 17 months. Pure greed also played its part because in 1871 a tannery, which is a place that makes leather, found a way of making high-quality leather from buffalo hides. The price of buffalo shot up and thousands upon thousands of buffalo were killed for the expensive leather. In 1882 it was estimated that 5,000 skinners and hunters were at work on the Great Plains. And so to the last part of our podcast. We've had a look at the causes of the conflicts between Indians and the United States. We've had a look at specific conflicts, and we've had a look at the reasons why the US were able to overcome the Indians. Now we must look at one final aspect, the ghost dance. In 1890, an Indian named Wavoka claimed to have had a vision in which he was told that all Indians everywhere had to dance, dance, and keep dancing, and it would bring dead Indians back to life, so that they would join currently living Indians in sweeping away the white settlers, leaving the land to the Indians once more. Word spread between the tribes, and thousands of Indians broke into dance. This really worried the US, particularly because many of the Indians, danced with rifles held above their head. US President Harrison ordered the army in to take control. On one reservation, the famous chief Sitting Bull was killed in a botched arrest attempt, shot by an Indian police officer from his own Sioux tribe. Sitting Bull's followers fled south to join the Cheyenne on their reservation, but the US Army soon caught up with them. Due to the terrible snows and because many of them were suffering from pneumonia, the Indians surrendered, and were led along to Wounded Knee Creek, the site of what was to become known as the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. But it wasn't really much of a battle, more of a slaughter. When the army moved to disarm the Indians, at least one Indian resisted, and many of them began to dance. The army opened fire, and 10 minutes later, 250 Indians and 25 US Army soldiers lay dead. Private Jesse Harris said, "Afterwards, I heard remarks from other soldiers. This is where we got even for the Battle of Little Bighorn." The Ghost Dance and the Battle of Wounded Knee are the last sad chapters in the story of the Plains Indians. In roughly 50 years, they had gone from proud hunter warriors with a society that had existed for centuries to living on small reservations, struggling to farm, often starving, and relying on the US government. All because of greed. Greed for land, greed for gold, or greed for buffalo leather. I've been Otters, and this was an Ossett History podcast. Remember to use this podcast to help you with your revision notes, but to be most effective, you should also use your exercise books and any revision guides that you have bought. Good luck with your revision.